Hey, this is Melisha, and I want to welcome you to April's Flipped Coding webinar. So, Flipped Coding is the place that people come to learn web development after they've already been through the free tutorials, but they still have questions or need a little bit more help. So, today's webinar, we're going to learn about C# and kind of how you use it in the back-end development world. So, what we're going to do is make a really simple console app just to demonstrate kind of like the class structure and how you go about architecturing a back-end program, basically. So, just so you know, at the end of the webinar, there's going to be a really special offer for those of you that stick around. And if you stick through it all, you'll actually have a working C# app. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, now that we've gotten the introductions out of the way, I want to make sure that you have Visual Studio installed. So I sent out an email yesterday making sure that you knew about it, but just in case you didn't have time, because I understand it's the weekend, in case you didn't have time, here's the link that you can go download Visual Studio. Just make sure you get the community version. That's the free one. And if you can't quite follow this link, you can just Google Visual Studio community version or just Visual Studio download, and it'll take you right to the page. So now that we've gotten that out the way, you know which IDE we're going to be using. Let's talk a little bit about C# itself. So C# is strongly typed, and what that means is you typically have to declare a variable by using its data type. In JavaScript, you usually just write var and then the name of the variable, and then it figures out it usually figures out what the variable's data type is based off of the value you give the variable. But in C#, you have the option of predefining that data type, and that gives you a little bit of a failsafe because you know for a fact what kind of data is going to be in that variable. So you still have the option of declaring variables with var in C#. It's just really rarely used, or it's used in special situations. Most of the time you want to go ahead and declare variables with their data types. So instead of var, you'll see int and a variable name, or you'll see string and the variable name. And then something else you need to know about, like most web development languages, C# is object oriented. So that means, well, you'll be working with objects, which is pretty good because JavaScript is also object oriented. So if you know the syntax to write JavaScript code, you pretty much know the syntax to write C# code. You know how to write a for loop in JavaScript, you know how to write if-else statements, you know how to do all of that in C# already. So just so you know, if you've already done some programming, picking up the C# syntax isn't going to be that hard for you. But let's talk a little bit about object-oriented programming. So this is going to come up a lot, and it's important you understand some of the basic concepts of object-oriented programming. So first, we'll talk a little bit about objects. Think about objects like a pizza. So you can have different toppings, you can get it from different places, but at the end of the day, a pizza has the same properties. It has a crust, some sauce, some cheese, and maybe some toppings. But every pizza you make or every pizza you order, they all have those three things minimum. That's what an object is. An object is kind of like a pizza for your code. So you can have different kinds of the same object, if that makes sense. And they all have the same properties and the same methods or functions that you can use. So that'll kind of segue into what inheritance is. So in object-oriented programming, you work a lot with classes. And classes are the templates for objects. So every time you write a new class, you're making a template for a new kind of object. And in those classes, you'll define any properties for the object. So using our pizza example, you'll define that, hey, this object needs to have a crust, this object needs to have a sauce property, or whatever. You define all of the properties that you want that object to have. And you also define the methods or the functions you want all of those objects to have. So in your class, you can write a function, or in C# they're known as methods. You can write a function or a method that you can use across any object you ever make in your code. And that's where inheritance comes in. Sometimes you'll have new objects you want to make, but you want to use the properties and methods from a class you already have. So what you do is you take that existing class and you make sure that the new class inherits from it. So whenever you inherit from a class, just remember, you get access to all of the properties and methods from that inherited class. Which also segues into what polymorphism is. Polymorphism is just a big word to say, I have a couple methods, and they have the same name, but the implementation form is completely different. So using our pizza example, you could have a method that says get price, and you might need to adjust the way you implement that method based on the inputs you get. So let's say somebody just wants a crust, some sauce, and some cheese. So they just want a cheese pizza. You might do a different price calculation based on that input. But let's say somebody wants to have a pizza that has a crust, sauce, cheese, and toppings. So that's another parameter you just added on there, the toppings. And you might need to do, I don't know, some kind of calculation based on if it's meat or if it's a vegetable or a different kind of cheese. And then you need a completely different method. But you need these two separate methods to have the same name, because when you make a new object, you don't necessarily want to have to specify a new method every time you want to call that get price. So polymorphism lets you have two methods with the same name, just different implementation. And the last concept I want to talk about is called encapsulation. So basically what this means is you limit the access that users have to certain parts of your code. So you definitely don't want anybody to see stuff like social security numbers or even birthdays. You want to make sure that nobody else has access to that information except the people who are supposed to. So encapsulation makes sure that your code is behind enough layers where that delicate information or those really sensitive operations are out of harm's way. So if somebody hacks you, for example, they won't be able to get to that information easily. These are some of the main concepts you'll see in object-oriented programming. And if you do have some more questions about them, I have quite a few articles about these particular concepts on flippedcoding.com. Just go check out the resources section and you can read all about it. So now we need to learn about .NET Core. .NET Core is just a framework that lets us use other people's code really easily. And that's why we have these NuGet packages. NuGet packages are basically just a fancy way of saying, hey, I need some code that does this thing and I don't really want to write it. Has anybody else written it? Let me go look through the NuGet packages for some code that does this thing I need it to do. That's one really great thing about .NET Core is you have access to all those different libraries. And then to top it off, it supports multiple frameworks across at least the most common operating systems. So you can run your application on a Linux machine, a Windows machine, or a Mac. You can use all three of those operating systems without having to drastically change your code. And where that really comes into play is when you're finished with your application and you need to put it on a server, you want to make sure that it's going to be able to run on that server, which means it has to be able to work with that operating system. So with .NET Core, you don't really have that worry about, is this going to work with my operating system on the server? Or do I need to worry about what operating system is on the server? It just takes out that little bit of anxiety. And then they have really, really good tools to handle microservices. So microservices are basically APIs, and an API is pretty much code that you let users use. So for example, when you pull up the Weather Channel app on your phone and you type in your location, you just made an API call because you gave it some input and then it gives you some kind of result. So you put in your location, it does some magic behind the scenes, and it shows you what the temperature is for that location. So .NET Core makes all of these things really easy for you to do, and that's super important for back-end development because you don't necessarily know what libraries you're going to need or what operating system you'll be on, or even if you'll need APIs like that. So .NET Core just makes it a little bit more streamlined for us to go through back-end development. So now that we've gotten all of the little class educational stuff out of the way, let's get rid of this PowerPoint show and just jump straight into Visual Studio. So if you don't have Visual Studio pulled up or you need to download it and install it, this is what it should look like when you open it the first time. You might have some kind of startup screen here, but it's nothing just crazy. So what we're going to do is go ahead and make our new console app project. So you're going to go up here to File, go over here to New, and click Project. So, it already has it for us. So we're going to be working with a console app in the .NET Core framework. Make sure you do not choose the .NET framework. It doesn't work the same as .NET Core. So console app .NET Core. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and name this app. We're going to make this little calorie tracker. It's nothing fancy, but it'll give you a good feel for how you do back-end development. Also, make sure you know where you're saving this. That might help you out later. So go ahead and hit OK. Oh, sorry about that. Maybe I need to know where I'm saving this. So I'm going to go ahead and change my location and hit OK. And the great thing about Visual Studio, it generates a lot of code for you. So you're not starting completely from scratch, but you basically are. So it just makes this solution for us, and it has this small program file. Now that we have the shell of our app set up, we can go ahead and add our first class. But before we do that, I want to make sure that you understand exactly what a class is. So in object-oriented programming, you know that everything is an object. So when you see classes or you're building classes, that means you're making a template for an object. So basically, you've just made the outline for a custom object. And that means you set the properties and the methods that you want that object to have, and it won't have anything else. So that's what a class is, and now we can go ahead and make one. So to do that, you're going to come up over here in the Solution Explorer, and you're going to right click on this calorie tracker. And then you're going to go down the list. Yours might look a little different, but you'll go down the list until you see Add, and then when you see this menu, we're going to go ahead and click Class. So you can leave all of this alone. You don't have to change anything. But down here, we do want to set the name for this class. So we're going to call it calorie record. And just so you know, you can leave the .cs off if you want. It'll still save it the same way. I just personally like to leave that extension on. So we're going to go ahead and add that. And now we have just an empty class. So you'll notice that this text up here, our using statements, they turned gray. That means we aren't using them. So if you like to keep your code super clean, you can hover over any of these and you'll see this light bulb pop up. And you can just click remove unnecessary usings and it gets rid of them. But for now, I'm going to leave it there just so we can focus on making our class. The first thing I want you to notice is this namespace. So we are inside the calorie tracker namespace. That's exactly what we expect. The next thing I want you to see is that we have our class declared right here. And it's a class of calorie record, which we expect because that's what we named it. The one thing we want to add to this class is the public access modifier. So what this does, it lets this class be accessible from anywhere else in your code. And typically that's what you want when you get more into security and issues with data integrity. You might change this a little bit, but for what we're doing, we want this calorie record class to be accessible everywhere. So now we can jump down inside of the curly braces and we will make our constructor, one of our constructors, and it will also have the public access modifier, and it's just going to be public calorie record, some parentheses and some curly braces. So what we've done here, this is called a constructor, and what a constructor does is just a function that executes as soon as you instantiate an object. So we'll see what it looks like to instantiate an object when we make our next class, but for now what I want you to know is that this is a empty zero argument constructor. That means we don't have anything from anywhere we need to load or pull from the database before we can use our new object. That's what this is. So now what we're going to do is make another constructor. So it's going to be same public access modifier, the same method name, except this time inside of our parentheses we're going to pass it 3 parameters. So when we're trying to log our calories, we'll probably want to know what we ate. So I'm just going to call this description and it'll be a string. And then you might want to log, well, I did this exercise today. So we're going to go ahead and make that a parameter that's also a string called exercise. And the last parameter we're going to take in is an integer that represents the, I guess, calorie amount for that food and exercise combined. So this is just going to be an int that we call calorie amount. So that's it for the parameters. We're going to go ahead and use our curly braces, which I'm not sure if you caught that, but whenever you do an opening curly brace in Visual Studio, it automatically completes it for you and puts that closing one there. And if you push enter inside of that curly brace, it will automatically drop it to the next line. So just a little cool thing Visual Studio does to make this easier for you. So the next thing we're going to do is inside of this constructor, we're going to set our properties equal to the values of these parameters. So you're probably wondering, what the heck is a property? I don't know what that is. Where is it? We haven't made them yet. It's the beauty of code. You don't have to do everything in order. So we know for sure that we are going to have these three properties for this class. So what we're going to do is, let's just go ahead and write the property names and set them equal to our parameter values. So again, I know we haven't done anything with capital D description, but just hang on until we get through this constructor and you'll see how it works out. So we're going to have another property for our exercise. We're going to set it to the value of that parameter, and our last property is going to be calorie amount, and we'll set this to that parameter value as well. So you'll notice if you hover over the errors, it'll tell you that the name description does not exist in the current context, blah blah blah. So we're going to go ahead and make those properties, which is really simple. Again, we're going to use our public access modifier so we can access these properties from anywhere. And of course, description is just gonna be a string. Then this is where it gets a little interesting. We need to put a get and set method inside of this property. So what we've done here is just say, hey, you can get this value from the database or from somewhere else in the code. No problems, and you don't have to run through any code to work with it. Also, you can set this value in the database or elsewhere in the app, and you won't have any issues or problems. You don't need to go through any code. So we're going to do the same thing with the exercise property. If I can spell right. We're going to give it a get and a set method as well. And then we're going to do the same thing with our calorie amount. And don't forget the get and the set. Hopefully you can type a little bit better than me. But this is it. This is our calorie record class. So let's just do a quick recap of what happened here. These are properties. And it's just a best practice that when you have properties in your class, you always start them off with a capital letter. So we're using Pascal casing, if that helps. And these properties are all public, which means when we create a new object, a new calorie record object, we have access to these properties regardless of where we are in the code. So we know what the public access modifier does. Now this little get set thing, this is so we can work with the values that these properties have. And usually in applications, your properties will send data to the database, or they'll pull data from somewhere else in the code, or you might need to send data to the database or elsewhere in the code. And without these get and set methods, it won't do anything for you. So this is also best practice. Always do this. This is called the auto property, and this is the easiest kind of property you can have because you don't have to write any special code for the get and set methods. Then let's talk about these constructors a little bit. So what we've done here is actually overloading. So we have two constructors, which are methods that have the same name, but they have different parameters. So you see here we have 3, and here we have, well, none. So that means whenever we make the new object, it's going to see if we put any parameters in or not. If we didn't put any parameters in, it'll execute this version of the constructor, which does nothing, and that's what we want if we don't have any parameters. We don't want it to do anything. But if we do have parameters and we want to make sure those values get set in the properties, then it will automatically know to call this implementation of the constructor. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, just ask me questions in the chat or the comments, and I'll try to explain it there a little bit more. So now we're done with this class. It's completely finished. So now we're going to move on and make our next class. So we're going to make our new class the same way we made this one. You're going to right click on Calorie Tracker here, go to Add, and then click on Class. This time, make sure class is selected, but this time we're going to name our class Tracker Activities. So this is going to help us keep up with everything we're putting into our calorie tracker. Alright, so we'll go ahead and add that. And as usual, Visual Studio makes this little empty file for us. So here's your new class, Tracker Activities. This is the file. We're going to go ahead and make this class public because we will need it. And I guess let's just jump right into it. So kind of the structure for this one, we're going to have a few different methods, and we're going to have a few different variables. So our first variable is going to be the date. Usually when people do a calorie tracker, they want to know what day that they did a certain activity or ate a certain food. So we want this to be accessible outside of this class, so we make it public and static. And we'll give it a data type of date time, and we'll name this variable just date, nothing fancy. And then we'll take advantage of the date time object. So the datetime object gives you a lot of different methods and properties to work with. As you can see here, there's quite a few. So the one we're going to use is now, which if you read the little pop-up that Visual Studio gives you, it tells you that it gets a datetime object that's set to the current date and time on your computer. So we're going to use that, but for our app, we want to keep it simple, so we're not going to worry about what time you enter the record. We just want the date. So if you want to keep up with everything you ate today, this has you covered. And our next variable is also going to be another public static, so we can access it outside of the class. And this one is a little different. So we want to make a list of all of our calorie records for the day or the month, however long. And the way we're going to handle that is by making a list that we add records to. So how we do that, we are going to give it a list type. And a list is what they call a generic. And a generic means that, hey, you can take this particular object and make it any data type you want. It's not constrained to a certain data type. So whenever you get in an interview and you hear people ask about generics, just remember a generic is an object that you can give any data type to. In this case, our list is going to have a data type of calorie record. So how we do that is, inside of these angle braces, we just put calorie record. And it automatically knows to reference this class, so we'll have access to these properties. Now, we need to name it. And Visual Studio is really good about giving you suggestions. So this is going to be a list of calorie records, so we're going to call it calorie records. Now, the one thing you need to do whenever you have a list or an array or some kind of collection, you always need to instantiate a new object or a new array, whatever it is you're working with. In this case, we're going to make a new, gosh, I love Visual Studio. It just does so much for you. So we're going to make a new list that has a data type of calorie record. And that's it. These are the two variables that we have to work with so far. Now, we are going to go ahead and make one of the methods we'll call in our code later on. So this one is going to be public. It's going to be static so we can access it outside of the class. Except this return type is going to be different. So whenever you see void in the return type, that means, hey, this method is going to run some kind of code, but it's not going to return any data. So that's what void means. We're going to run some code, but we aren't going to return any data or values from it, which is really pretty common. So we are going to name this method create calorie record. If I can spell. Okay. Then we're going to give it some parameters. The first one is going to be a string, and it's going to give us the description of our food. Then the next parameter is going to be another string, and it's going to be the name of whatever exercise we did. And the last parameter is just going to be an integer, and it's going to be the amount of calories we have for that activity or that time period, whatever you want to call it. Then we'll go ahead and put our curly braces. So now this is what we're going to do. All we want this method to do is add a new calorie record to our list we made up here. So to do that, really easy. We're going to use our variable calorie records, same as that up there. And we're going to use the add method. So add is a method that is on the list object. But since our variable calorie records has an instance of this list object, we have access to all of the list methods and properties and everything else we need to work with this really easy. So we're going to do add, and usually common convention you space down, and we're going to say we're going to add a new calorie record. And this new calorie record is going to have, we need to set the properties for it. So we want the description to be equal to whatever this description is up here. Then we're going to want to define the exercise property. And it's going to be the same as this, same exercise. And lastly, we're going to give it the calorie amount, which you can probably guess is just this calorie amount up here. So just to keep it clean, we're going to tab that over and put our semicolon. All right, that's it for this method. All we did was say, hey, we're going to take some input, the description, the exercise, and the calorie amount, and we're going to make a new calorie record object, which the properties for the calorie record get those input values, and we just add that to our list. That's all this function or method is doing. So you might be thinking, hey, I put all these records in there. How do I get them back? This is even easier than what we just did. So first things first, we're going to make this public. And we're going to make it static so we have access to it. And this method is going to have a return type of list calorie record. And we're going to name it get. Wow, Visual Studio is really smart. So we're going to name it get calorie records. And we don't need to take in any parameters because we just want to look at that list of calorie records we have so far. So go ahead and put your curly braces. And if you notice, I want to point this out. If you notice, we have an error. And it says, blah, 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 not all code paths return a value. So what this means is since we set a return data type, we have to return something of that data type from this method. Where unlike up here, we have void for our quote-unquote data type. That means it wasn't expecting anything to be returned. But in this case, we are just going to return the list of our calorie records. So we just return that variable calorie records. So let me explain something. All of these calorie records are the exact same thing. We're referencing this variable up here. So what's happening is whenever you call this create calorie record method, you are adding a new record onto this list, and that gets stored in memory somewhere. So when we call the get calorie records, we just get that list from memory. That's it. That is all this function does. It's pretty nice, pretty simple. And then our last method for this class is gonna help us figure out what our total calorie intake for the day was, or for the week, whatever time period you want to say this is for. It's also going to be public and static, so we can access it outside of the class. But this time, we're going to return just an integer. And we're going to name this method total calorie calculation. Ooh. Again, this one isn't going to take any parameters because we have everything we need right here in our calorie records list. So, for now, you can ignore the red squiggly. You don't have an error yet. We just haven't written the code. So, first thing we're going to do is make a new variable to hold our calorie count. So, we're so creative. We're going to name it total calorie count, except initially it's going to be 0. You want to start your counter variables off with some kind of initialization. So in this case, we don't want to start with any calories just randomly added. So we're going to set this total calorie count to 0. And then we're going to get a little fancy here. So we're going to use our calorie records list. Remember, same thing, same thing, same thing. So we're going to use our calorie records list. And we're going to use this for each method. So basically, for each is exactly what it sounds like. So for each calorie record we have in this list, we're going to do something with it. First thing we're going to do is make up the name for just our, I guess you could say it's like, it's a placeholder variable. So this right here is just going to represent each individual calorie record as we go through the list. Now we're going to get a little fancy. We're going to use an arrow function and write some code in it. So you'll notice we just have the curly brace right after the arrow function, nothing fancy. And to do this total calorie count, or this total calorie calculation, we're going to take our total calorie count variable and we're going to add to it the calorie amount from each calorie record. To do that, I'm going to show you a little shorthand. Whenever you want to add a number to a variable, multiple times, you can just do plus equals. Programming is weird, but you can just use plus equal, and we're going to take our calorie record, which is this right here, and we're going to do dot calorie amount. Okay, so that's our line of code right there. And we're gonna, don't forget that semicolon. And then lastly, we're gonna return the total calorie count. Whew, okay, that seems like it was a lot. So let's just go through this one more time. Right, we made our initial variable. So this is what's gonna hold how many calories we ate or consumed for a day. And initially, we're going to say is 0, because let's say you start in the morning, you haven't eaten anything, you haven't done anything, so you don't want a value here. So we set it to 0. Then we get our list of calorie records and use the for each method to loop through them all. So this is our variable that represents each individual calorie record in our list. So you could think of this, if you know about for loops, it's like the I variable. That's basically what it is. Then we make this arrow function, which is a lot fancier than it really is. And we write some code inside some curly braces. And what we're doing is taking the calorie amount from the current calorie record and adding it to the total calorie count. That's it. And then when we're done with that, we just return the total calorie count. And that's it. That's all we're doing for this class, so you can save it. And again, if you have any questions about anything we've done, or maybe something's not quite clear, feel free to drop it in the comments. That's what I'm here for. So now we're moving into the last thing we're going to work on to make this calorie tracker work. We're going to edit the program file. Alright, now go ahead and open the program file, and you'll see it's just another class. So with the program file, you don't necessarily have to make it public because you shouldn't be referencing this class anywhere else in your code. The program file is basically the file that begins all of your code execution. So if you're starting up an app, whether it's a console app or a web app or whatever kind of program you're running, it's going to start execution in this program class. So that's why when we run it, it just shows this quick little hello world console and immediately closes, because that's all the code we have in here. What we're gonna do is make this work with our classes. So how we're going to do that, first thing we're going to do is just change this line real quick to show users a message that just welcomes them to the app. So we'll do welcome to your calorie counter tracker. Okay, that's it. So now if you run it, you'll see really quickly it says welcome to your calorie tracker and just closes. So what we're going to do is have a few places we put input so that we can add things to our calorie list, well, our calorie records list here. So we have to give the user some kind of direction. So there will be a few console write lines, which you can probably guess. These just write the text to the console. That's all they do. So we're going to do another console write line. And we're going to ask a user to enter a description of their food. Enter description of your food. Okay, so this is just our first little instruction to the user. Now where it gets interesting, we're going to make a new variable, and we're just going to call it var, but it's going to hold the description that they enter. So to get user input from a console app, you just use console.readLine. That's it. It's that simple. So just to show you how this works, we'll go ahead and play it. And you'll notice it didn't just disappear immediately. That's because it's waiting on us to give it some kind of input. So whenever you have a console.readLine, the execution stops until somebody enters a value. So let's just see what happens. So we'll enter spaghetti and hit enter. Done. Nothing happened. It's what we expected. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to add a read line for our exercise and for the number of calories we consumed or burned for whatever. So we're going to do another console.WriteLine to tell the user to enter the number of calories in your food. And one quick note. If you notice back in our calorie record class, calorie amount is an integer. So that means we can't enter any type of decimal values, or the user can't enter any decimal values. So we're going to put a little note here to tell them to put in whole numbers only. This is just like a little validation thing, not really validation, but maybe it'll help them to use our app the right way. So we just gave them instructions on what we want them to do. So now we're going to make another variable, and we're going to call this one calorie amount. And can you guess what it'll do? It's going to be another console.readline. So they're going to put in some kind of whole number, hopefully, for the amount of calories in that food. Then the next thing we want to do is add a place for them to enter what exercise they've done. So first we want to give them some instructions. So console.WriteLine. And we'll tell them to enter one exercise you did today. And we're going to make a new variable called exercise so that we can get this description or the name of the exercise they did for the day. So console.readline again. Okay, so now we have our description, our calorie amount, and our exercise. So what we can do now is finally start using our classes and just doing a little work with them. So the first thing we want to do is create a new calorie record. And we'll do that by referencing the tracker activities class. And you see that create calorie record method? It tells you exactly what we need to enter. So we have all of those variables ready for us. So we're going to go ahead and make this new calorie record. So go ahead and put in your description, exercise, and calorie amount. And you probably noticed that calorie amount is throwing an error because we can't convert a string to an integer. There's a way around this. So you know everything in C# is an object. That means even data types are objects. So what we're going to do is take advantage of the int data type. So go ahead and type int and then do dot. So now you see there's a few different methods we can run, but we're going to use parse. What parse does, it takes some kind of value and tries to get an integer out of it. And that's exactly what we need. So we're going to parse this calorie amount as an integer. So basically that means we're going to turn this string into an integer if it lets us. And of course it will, because the user just put in a number anyways. So now we have created our first calorie record. Next thing we're going to do, just to show you a few things, we're going to go ahead and do our total calorie count, which we can also get from the tracker activities. So we're going to make a new variable in our program class. It's going to be an integer type, and it's going to hold the total calories we have. So we're going to use that total calorie calculation method from the tracker activities class to get that total calorie count. That's it for that. Then, if you remember, we were trying to keep track of some kind of date. So we're going to get that date that this calorie record has been entered. We're going to make a new variable. It's going to be date time. we're just going to name it date, and it's going to be equal to the tracker activities property that is date. So if you go back here, you can see date right there, right in the tracker activities class. And that's going to be it, because we need our date. Whoop, if I can click in the right spot. Okay, so now we have our total calories and we have our date. What we're going to do with that is just write it to our console. So how we do that, your favorite, console.writeLine, if I can spell writeLine, yes. And we're going to say, here is your calorie count, including your exercise as of. Now, it's important to keep the space right here, or else it won't be as readable to a user. So we're going to do a string concatenation by using the plus sign. All that means is we're going to take this part and add the next part to it. That's it. So we want to know the calorie count as of this date. So we're going to use our date variable. And then we're going to keep concatenating. And we're going to put just a little semicolon, because we're about to show the number of calories we've had. And it wouldn't hurt to put a space in there as well, just to keep it clear. And we're also gonna append the total calories. And that's it. And don't forget the semicolon. But now this is going to print back to you everything that you entered up here, kind of as like a confirmation check to make sure you put in the right information. So after that, we are going to give them just a little, little message for how they can get out of this app. So we're going to say console writeLine and hit any button to exit. And then we're going to put a read key. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between read key and read line. It's just with read key, you're only expecting one button to be pushed, whereas read line, you expect maybe an entire string or even a paragraph to be written. So what we've done here is we've taken this little console app and made it into something that users can actually do something with. So let's go ahead and run it and see how it works. Okay, so we'll enter our food description. I'm just gonna go with spaghetti. Oh, see, something new. So now we need to enter the number, little typo, but enter the number of calories in your food is what it should say. So we're gonna say it's like, I don't know, 500 maybe? Hit enter. And then we'll enter exercise we did today. So I did some deadlifts earlier, so we'll put that in there. This is what you get. This is just that little, this right line down here. So here's your calorie count, including your exercise as of 4/23/2019. And that's the time, but it doesn't really have one, because if you look back here, we just got the date. That's it. So we have 500 calories because of this spaghetti and our deadlifts. And you notice it has the hit any button to exit, and you can just hit any button and it'll close out the console window. Just like that. So, we are done. This is how you write C# code within the .NET Core framework to make a console app. If you have any questions up to this point, just let me know in the comments.